Today, we will be discussing the agricultural export boom in Cuba and Mexico, with particular attention to its impact across social groups. The export boom occurred over many decades, and its social impacts are still being felt today. Due to the density of information in this topic, we have distilled it for you into four more distinct topics. Audrey will talk to you about how Cuba and Mexico's racial demographics and relations shifted during this time. Brennan will dive into ways in which land reform affected millions. Connor will break down its effect on social class and status, and Kelly will discuss the export boom's political ramifications. But before we get into the impacts of the agricultural export boom in Mexico and Cuba, let us provide an extremely condensed recount of what the agricultural boom export boom actually was with Mexico. Starting with Mexico, we see that in the 1850s, the economy began to rely more heavily on the export sector, particularly with raw agricultural materials. Moving forward 10 years, the Liberal government reforms land in favor of the export economy. As the exporting class, the railroads that were built under Porfirio Diaz began to connect agricultural centers and export hubs, and thus the industry grows. Over the following 3 decades, haciendas become more mechanized. The export economy grows, and its side effects correspondingly grow stronger. Tensions rise in the country as a result of the export boom's ill effects, and in 1910, 2 years after Mexico becomes the third largest sugarcane producer on earth, revolution topples the Porfirio. Now with Cuba, Cuba's first influx of labor for the increased work demand of the export boom included 573,000 slaves brought from Africa to Cuba between 1817 and 1867. This large amount of cheap labor, as well as the prevalence of railroads in the 1860s, fueled the rework of Cuba's sugar industry. Between the late 1860s and late 1890s, a series of wars have troubled the country, beginning with the 10 Years' War, the Little War, and ending with the War of Independence between Cuba and Spain. Within these years, slavery was abolished in Cuba in 1886, changing the way labor could be acquired. Towards the close of the independence wars, the United States became involved in 1898. The war ends with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in December of 1898, transferring the sovereignty of Cuba from Spain to the United States. This is where the stage was truly set for the transformation of Cuba's sugar industry and the explosion of their economy. U.S. military occupation in Cuba began shortly after this treaty, and the way business was conducted in Cuba was changed forever. The U.S. was able to encroach upon cheap land from war-torn Cuba and created laws and ordinances in their own economic favor. National and racial tensions during this period were high, with conflict between Afro-Cuban and other non-white cultivators and the American sugar overseers, resulting in the Race War of 1912, and the Cuban elite efforts to whiten the country. As displaced black workers shifted into other professions, the discrimination followed them. Employers opted towards white workers, leaving Afro-Cubans and other non-white workers at a disadvantage, leaving them to jobs of lower skill and pay. These type of grievances sparked unionization across the country, leading to strikes in many different enterprises, including cigar production and port workers. Now, I'm Brendan, and I will discuss land reform. So it is important to first note the land reform that took place as a result of Porfirio Diaz consolidating his power. Porfirio Diaz's goal as president of Mexico was overwhelmingly to bring Mexico to a more quote-unquote modern state. Diaz believed that Mexico was stuck in archaic ways, and he moved aggressively to put forth more modern concepts of property ownership and economic boosters to connect Mexico. Hence why the largest and most pertinent symbol of Mexico at this time was the modern locomotive and train tracks. As far as lands that were used by peasants, as in most agrarian peasant societies, peasants did not have a formal claim to the land they farmed on. Porfirio Diaz believed that it was in Mexico's best interest for companies to buy up land and create cash wage systems so that crops and goods could be sent to international markets, instead of simply sustaining the people who engaged in subsistence farming. He and other modernizers valued on the ability to engage in material growth, and therefore more market access and money. Diaz also believed that if the land of peasants was taken away, they would have an incentive to go to larger cities and seek employment there, boosting Diaz's ideas of cities as places of modernity and progress, while seeing peasantry, who live in villages and toil in the fields, as backwards and opposite of the goals for Mexico. Articles 26 and 27 of the 1857 Mexican Constitution expedited the ability to take away lands and privatize them. Hence, it was taken away from them because they did not have any formal documentation which stated they were able to operate on these lands. they meaning peasants. Obviously, this freed up land in South and Central Mexico for large companies with the capital and technological abilities to invest. Therefore, boosting Diaz's goal of agricultural land and modernization for exportable agricultural goods. This took people away from dependable sources of water and land which fed their families, causing political impacts to peasants and village infrastructure in Mexico. Clearly, the modernization Diaz was after was not without the social and political impacts to the people who lived off these lands.
The export boom demanded a parallel boom in the form of labor. Between the weak governments of Mexico and Cuba and the interests of enterprising capitalists from beyond, this labor was largely accumulated through coercion. In Mexico, this could be recognized in the systemic erosion of communal lands. Indigenous peoples who had historical land claims were deemed vagrant by the government, and their land was purchased cheaply by private interests. This created a seemingly permanent underclass of indigenous laborers, many of whom had become sharecroppers and tenant farmers on their once communal property. This system was codified through a head tax in 1871 and became more constricting through an 1880 law that deemed those who failed to pay their taxes could be arrested and sold to potential employers, despite involuntary labor being outlawed in 1857. Cuba was more honest with its use of slave labor, with slavery remaining legal until its abolition in 1886. Unfortunately, the appetite for cheap labor which had initially attracted investors to the last major bastion of slavery in Latin America were hardly satisfied, and like Mexico, a new means of extracting cheap labor and crushing dissent was formed. Similar to the vagrants who occupied the historically communal land in the Huasteca region of Mexico, a boom in American-bought land in Cuba led to the violent repression of Afro-Cuban peasants and workers who were deemed squatters. In both cases, the privatization of property led to foreign investors buying up enormous swaths of land for export. This created displacement and rural poverty among local populations, creating a permanent underclass to perform effectively indentured labor in the post-slavery era in order to meet the demands of the export boom.
In the relatively early days of the export boom, due to the land reforms that favored haciendas, peasant communities initially resisted by banding together to maintain or reacquire community-owned lands. As the export industry boomed, dispossession was exacerbated and water rights were overlooked. Generally speaking, peasant and indigenous peoples overwhelmingly bore the burdens of the export boom, while seldomly reaping the benefits. Reaching higher levels of injustice and dispossession, peasant communities began to air their grievances with local government bodies. However, this fell on unsympathetic ears that largely favored haciendas. The next step in resistance was to campaign against the re-election of Porfirio Diaz, the president that oversaw the land reform. Eventually, agitation grew to a point where we could see peasant uprisings that destroyed haciendas and redistributed the land in the name of agrarian reform. In the southern state of Morelos, an agrarian reformist by the name of Emiliano Zapata gained notoriety for his resistance to the land reform and haciendas expansion. By 1910, the Mexican Revolution began, and Emiliano Zapata was one of the leaders, most notably in the South. Today, inspired by El Plan de Ayala, our Week 8 reading, Zapatismo remains a social justice movement in Mexico that resists many of the same issues of exclusion and marginalization that we saw during the export boom. Now, looking to Cuba, we see that there was slave resistance and rebellion to the sugar boom's lucrative labor structure, but these were mostly disjointed and small scale, often falling short of any real change. However, as a positive feedback loop of sugar industry and slave labor built momentum, slave rebellions became larger and harder to ignore or suppress. At this time, the Spanish-Cuban relationship strengthens due to the sugar industry. But when the price of sugar collapses in the late 1850s, many Cubans felt the negative effects, and the nation becomes more dependent on Spain than it would like to be. At the same time, conservatives take over in Spain's federal government. Promises made to Cuba by the previous liberal government are broken, and revolutionary sentiments grow, especially among the marginal and disenfranchised in Cuba, including slaves. Cuban poet and essayist Jose Marti, who wrote Our America, our Week 4 reading, pushes for independence, along with many other Cubans. And sentiments like these eventually culminate into 3 consecutive wars: the 10 Years' War, the Little War, and Cuba's War of Independence.
Regarding Cuba's export boom, the effects of this event on Cubans were different based on race and social status. The increased demand for labor and sugar production brought a multitude of laborers from around the world, changing Cuba's racial demographics forever. African slavery was widespread in the 1800s, leading to a large population of Afro-Cubans in the area. Much of the output produced in the earlier parts of Cuba's sugar boom was done so through slave labor. When slavery was abolished in Cuba in 1886, it left a conflict between Afro-Cuban farmers and U.S. sugar overseers over land ownership and access. The United States bought up cultivation land after the independence wars for cheap and set out to modernize the sugar industry. This dispossessed the land and property of a multitude of black cultivators, forcing them to either become tenants of this industry-owned land or leave. Many left for eastern Cuba, but were met with a similar problem when the United States eventually bought that land as well. The tensions between these squatters on their original land and government forces led to the Race War of 1912, resulting in the deaths of 5,000 to 6,000 Afro-Cubans by the hand of government forces. While Cuba's sugar industry was rapidly expanding, people from around the world were pouring into the country to account for labor needs in hopes of involvement with the booming economy. A trend among Latin American policymakers at this time was to attempt to subsidize white immigration, offering stipends per immigrant of desired countries, such as the case of Panama in 1910's Military Order 155. This order offered a $5 stipend to every white Panamanian immigrant to Cuba. These efforts to whiten the country were no match to the dramatic labor demands of the export boom, making most of these plans obsolete in the need for bodies. Employers and elites in Cuba during this period were disproportionately white and preferred white employees to black. This manifested through white immigrants receiving better and higher paid positions than their native-born Cuban counterparts. This was prevalent in the cigar industry, with Spaniards frequently having higher paid and skilled positions than native-born Cubans. These workplace issues sparked the beginning of unionization in Cuba, forming groups such as the League of Cuban Workers. These groups organized a variety of strikes and protests, which were usually met by strikebreakers and taken down quickly. The unions formed were usually multiracial and multinational, and strikebreakers were usually white peasants. Though unionization fought a tough battle in the age of the export boom, its roots introduced the idea of banding together in the workplace and eventually led to more successful groups. As agricultural exports gained importance in Mexico, more and more labor was needed to mobilize this economic growth. Surrounding the most fertile sections of land for agricultural production were indigenous Mexican communities. As this land was bought up cheaply by foreign investors, the indigenous communities that this land housed were repeatedly oppressed. Local elites took and transformed villages into labor reserves. Communities were paid a small pittance and expected to contribute their adult men as labor, and communities were repressed if they resisted. This non-voluntary indigenous labor was outlawed in 1857, but the negative effects that these communities faced did not end. Taxes on indigenous workers were instituted, and if unpaid, warranted immediate arrest and the auction of the accused to employers for the value of their unpaid tax. Indigenous people often were involved with sharecropping, paying landowners inflated prices to farm. Indigenous people were treated in ways that completely discarded their humanity and rightful ownership of land, purely based on vulnerability, for capitalist profit of elites and foreign investors. Indigenous Mexicans suffered greatly at the hands of their native country, all seemingly justified on the basis of progression of Mexico as a whole.